Dear friends, Wilbert works in Gloucestershire on the Dean Forest Railway. He kept asking if he could meet Thomas, and at last the fat controller managed to arrange it. The visit was not without its mishaps, but I know that Wilbert enjoyed himself. We hope that you will enjoy the stories of his adventures on the island of Sodor as much as he and the other engines did. The author.
Percy's Porridge. Donald and Douglas were rushed off their wheels. The fat controller came to see them. "I know you don't mind hard work," he said, "but you can't be everywhere at once. You need some help on the branch lines." The Scottish twins were grateful. "I have a plan," the fat controller told them. He went to see a friend who lived in Gloucestershire and explained the problem. The friend took him to meet Wilbert, a smart blue saddle tank engine with 6 wheels. "Your owner says you can come and help me for a while," the fat controller told Wilbert. "Would you like that?" Wilbert was delighted. "Yes, please, sir," he said eagerly. His line in the Forest of Dean was short, and he was delighted for the chance to exercise his wheels. "If you are as good as I think you will be," the fat controller went on, "I know where I can get another engine like you, and then you'll be able to go back home." Percy was excited when he heard the news. "Another saddle tank, sir," he said. "Is he like me, sir?" The fat controller laughed. "He's bigger and stronger than you, Percy," he said. "Besides, you can manage your trucks. I want him to help Duck, so I'm afraid you may not even meet him." During the week before Wilbert came, it was cold and wet. The engines thought it would never stop raining. None of them wanted to go out, but passengers and trucks were waiting. "Just the sort of weather when you need porridge for breakfast," laughed Percy's driver. "What's porridge?" asked Percy. "It's difficult to describe," admitted the fireman. "You boil oatmeal and water, which makes a sort of sticky soup," finished the driver. "Then you add milk and sugar. Delicious." At the station by the river, sacks were being stacked on the platform. The men who had filled them had worked fast, and they had not tied the sacks properly. As the porter lifted the last sack, the signal arm dropped with a clang. "Better hurry, here's Percy," the porter said, and he swung the heavy sack onto the pile, knocking the top one over. Several sacks toppled onto the railway line and split open. But the oatmeal inside the sacks burst out, covering everything. The pouring rain quickly turned it into a sort of sticky soup. At that moment, Percy appeared. Percy wasn't going fast, but he couldn't prevent himself from ploughing into the porridge, which now covered the rails. "Ugh!" he exclaimed and stopped. Porridge dripped from Percy's wheels, rods and frames. He felt awful, wet, sticky and cold. His driver and fireman got down to inspect the mess. "Oh dear," remarked the driver. "Well, Percy, you found out about porridge the hard way, haven't you? The thing is, you're supposed to eat it, not paddle in it." Percy didn't think it was funny. The fat controller wasn't amused either. He telephoned to the junction where they were just in time to stop Wilbert on his way to Duck's branch line. He came along Thomas's line instead and soon reached the shed at the top station. Percy cheered up at once. "I wanted to meet you," he said, "but I didn't think it would be this way. Porridge is all right for breakfast, my driver says, but it makes a mess of an engine who isn't expecting it." Cab over wheels. "You're lucky to have a long line," Wilbert told Thomas and Toby. "Mine is only 1.5 miles long, with a station at Norchard and another at Lydney. The scenery is super though, and my driver says it's better up the valley. Our volunteers are going to open that bit too. They work hard, but it takes a long time." One of Wilbert's first jobs was at the lead mine. "Don't pass the danger notice," Thomas warned. "I fell down a mine once." Wilbert smiled. "I've worked in a colliery," he said, "so I know about danger notices. But," he added, "there was an engine once who thought he knew better." "What happened?" asked Toby and Thomas. Wilbert paused. "This engine didn't have a name," he began, "just a number, 16, and he worked in a steelworks. One of the jobs that 16 and his friends had to do was to take the waste from the works in special trucks to a place they called the tip. Well," went on Wilbert, 16 got tired of always stopping in the same place. He tried to go further, but his driver always prevented him. The other engines tried to stop him too. If the notice says danger, you shouldn't pass it, they said. 16 paid no attention. Don't be stupid, his driver said. We mustn't pass the notice, or goodness knows where we shall end up. But 16 wanted to know. Pooh, he scoffed. I can take care of myself. One wet day, 16's chance came. The rails were slippery, and when his driver tried to stop, he couldn't. You see, 16 had asked the trucks which were in front of him to carry on past the warning sign. They did just that, and their momentum pulled 16 with them. You silly engine, scolded his driver. Wasn't my fault, muttered 16 sulkily. It was those trucks. You always wanted to pass that board, said the driver crossly. I believe you asked them to drag us on purpose. A foreman ran towards them. What are you doing there, driver? He shouted. It's not safe. The trucks dragged us, explained the driver. Well, come to the office with me, and you, fireman, get your engine back on firm ground before it's too late, ordered the foreman. But it was already too late. As the foreman turned away, the earth beneath 16's wheels sank and the rails sagged. A small rush of stones clattered away to the bottom of the bank. 16's fireman knew that if he tried to move the engine now, he would only make things worse. Ooh, groaned 16. Beneath his weight, the rails sagged even more. Suddenly, they fell away completely. As the fireman leapt for safety, 16 overbalanced. The coupling between him and the trucks broke, and he rolled cab over wheels down the bank. He reached the bottom with a crash and lay on his side, looking surprised and leaking steam in all directions. Help! He gasped weakly. Thomas and Toby were silent. What happened to 16 after that? Ventured Toby. Oh, he was rescued, Wilbert said, but he wasn't repaired, and he was sent to the back of the shed in disgrace. Is he still there? Asked Thomas. He got better than he deserved, smiled Wilbert. Some preservation people came and bought him, and now he lives in the Midlands, but I think he's lucky to have been given a second chance. Thomas and Toby could only agree. Foaming at the funnel. There is a dairy beside Thomas's branch line at the station where the lines divide to go either to the harbour or to the junction. Every afternoon, special tanker wagons are pushed into the dairy siding. They are filled with milk, and Percy takes them to the junction on his first train every morning. Thomas explained this to Wilbert. There's a hose-pipe thing which puts the milk into the tankers, he said. They'll be ready by the time you get there for the first train. Sounds easy enough, said Wilbert. Thomas told him a great many other details too. Wilbert listened carefully, trying hard to remember them all. Next day he enjoyed himself. He was a much more powerful engine than Percy, so he found that he could cope easily with Percy's trains. The trucks behaved well too, which was a help. He's strong, he is, they muttered to each other. Don't upset him. You never know what he might do to get his own back. One day, Wilbert took loaded stone trucks to the harbour. On his way back with empty ones, he stopped at the station by the dairy and pushed the empty trucks into a siding. He left them and set out towards the junction, pulling just a few vans. Right, he thought happily, I leave these vans at the junction and bring the empty tankers back. Then, when those are put in the dairy siding, I take the stone trucks onto the top station. They met James at the junction. James knew who Wilbert was, of course, and asked how he was getting on. Wilbert chatted excitedly about the jobs he'd been given to do that day. Sounds as if you're enjoying yourself, James said, but it's best to take things slowly at first, and he puffed away. Wilbert continued his journey and reached the dairy station easily, but his fireman was worried about water. We should have filled up at the junction, he said, but you were busy chatting to James. Never mind, we'll get water here. The tankers were at the end of the train, so all Wilbert had to do was push them into the dairy siding. Then he drew forward and stopped beside the hose pipe. Just in time, said the fireman, and he put the hose into Wilbert's tank. As he turned the tap, the driver spoke to him. The fireman went to reply, but when he returned, he found that Wilbert had stopped at the wrong hose pipe. His tank was full, but not with water, with milk. You'll be foaming at the funnel if any of this gets in the boiler, gasped the driver. Quickly they put out Wilbert's fire, and the fireman telephoned for help. Thomas came as soon as he could and pulled Wilbert back to the top station. Wilbert's tank was emptied and was given a thorough clean. Next morning he was quite all right again. "You and Percy make a fine pair," laughed Thomas. "He had the porridge and you had the milk." Wired up. As soon as Percy came home, the Fat Controller came to see Wilbert. "You've done well so far," the Fat Controller told him, "apart from drinking all that milk." Wilbert looked abashed. "I'm sorry, sir," he said. "It's all right, Wilbert," smiled the Fat Controller. "A mistake any engine could make. But now Percy is back, you can go to help on Duck's branch line." Wilbert puffed away. Percy and the others were sorry to see him go. Duck and Oliver made Wilbert very welcome. Duck let him travel in front of his next train so that he could see what the line was like. Wilbert enjoyed this, but found running beside the sea very different from his sheltered valley in Gloucestershire. Next day he began regular work. During the afternoon he took some ballast wagons to the loading dock beside the small railway. Rex, Bert, Mike and Jock were delighted to show off their station to a new engine. Like the other trucks, those on Duck's line decided that they had better behave too. Donald and Douglas had kept them all in order, but Wilbert made sure they didn't forget what the twins had taught them. One day, Wilbert was at the ballast loader. As he tried to pull some full trucks away, there was a loud crack, and he shot suddenly backwards. The fireman got down to look. "The coupling gear on the wagon has pulled away," he said. "Now what?" Beside them, watching with interest, was Bert. "I pulled a train which was glued together once, when one of my couplings broke," he said. "We need more than glue here," said Wilbert's driver. Then he noticed a coil of signal wire lying beside the line. "Could we do anything with that?" he asked. "You'd never move the train with wire," objected the fireman. "But what about just one truck?" suggested Wilbert. "I bet I could pull one truck with wire." "Brilliant," said the station master, who'd come to see what was wrong. "I'll go and tell the signalman what you're doing. Let me know when you're ready." The fireman wound the wire round the truck's buffer beam, leaving long loops. These he twisted into a rope, making a small loop at the end, which he fastened to Wilbert's coupling hook. A shunter uncoupled the front truck from the rest, and at last everything was ready. "Right, Wilbert," said his driver. "Gently now." He opened the regulator very carefully, easing Wilbert slowly backwards. The wire tightened, stretched, and held. Slowly the truck followed Wilbert out of the siding, and he could then push it into another, out of the way. Then he went back to his ballast train. This time there was no trouble, and he reached the big station late, but safely. By the end of his stay, the Fat Controller knew that an engine like Wilbert was exactly what he needed. "I am delighted, Wilbert," said the Fat Controller. "Please take our best wishes to your friends in the Forest of Dean. We hope your line there will be as successful as your work here." Thomas, Percy, Toby and Daisy came to the junction to see Wilbert off, and whistled cheerfully as he passed. "Beep, beep," called Wilbert. "I've had a wonderful time, but I'm looking forward to getting home. Goodbye, and thank you." And with a whistle, he rounded the curve and disappeared into the tunnel.